Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book-to-show comparison for the Expanse Season 1, Episode 9, Critical Mass. This video is a part of a series of videos where I compare the Expanse TV show to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinion on how well I feel the adaptation worked. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for the Expanse up to the end of Season 2 and a spoiler warning for the first book, Leviathan Wakes. However, I will not spoil anything that hasn't occurred in the books, that hasn't occurred in the show, So if you haven't read the books, you are safe from spoilers provided that you have seen up to Season 2 and that you don't mind knowing how the books differ from the show, because that's the whole point of these videos. So in addition to the previously on segment, we start the episode proper. We get shown a scene again that had appeared in the previous episode with Miller talking to Musk, putting all the pieces together. Now at first I found this a little jarring, like why didn't they just include this scene in the previously on? Why are they yet again showing a scene from an earlier episode? But I suppose it's because the scene more than any other sets the stage for what happened to Julie Mao, which is the backstory we're about to get. Now, I talked about this scene already when we compared the books when I covered the episode it's from, but from a show watching perspective, I did find all the clues with Julie really confusing, so I did find it a bit helpful to be reminded of it. And plus the way it feeds into the episode starts well, so I don't have any complaints. But since this doesn't really relate to the books, I don't have a score for it. Okay, so now let me get into this Julie Mao sequence. And first let me say, overall, about the whole sequence, I was completely and totally blown away by it. I was blown away when I first saw the episode, and I'm still blown away watching the episode now. I was actually disappointed when the novels didn't have a Julie viewpoint chapter at this point in the story. She did have a viewpoint chapter, it has the prologue, but since that was before the story really began, they weren't able to go into as much detail. This segment in the show took elements from that chapter, but more importantly, elements from a journal that Miller found. But actually seeing it play out on screen was so much better, more entertaining, and getting you more familiar with Julie Mao than simply Miller reading her journal. So the first part of it, we see her on the Scopuli interacting with her fellow Belters and how they view her as a Belter. Now this is something we didn't get in the novels, although we saw hints of this in her prologue chapter and what Miller learned about her. We didn't actually get to see the moment they were attacked and abducted by the Anubis, and to see her interact with her fellow OPA operatives was absolutely and totally brilliant. So I'm going to give this a +5. So next we see Julie and the other Belters being brought on board the Anubis as captives, where the crew there beat them up and asked them what they're doing there. Now this is a very shortened version of what happened in the novels, as it went into more detail on the torture they received. And in the novels, when Miller boards the Anubis, he watches a recording of the Anubis crew trying to strip the Scopuli crew, but when they get to Julie, she beats the crap out of them and incites a short but failed attempt to break free. But they're just too overwhelmed, so the attempt fails. So this scene kind of resembles that as well, but again, it's much quicker here in the show, and much like the book, someone comes along and informs the soldier that Julie's different and orders them to separate her from the others and not harm her anymore. This is, of course, because she is the daughter of Jules Pierre Mao, who is in charge of this whole operation. Something that's actually indicated in the show that Julie is aware of, as in the previous scene, she refers to the Anubis crew as working for her father, something I don't think she was quite aware of in the novels. At any rate, they throw Julie in the cell, and then we hear some pretty on-the-nose dialogue from the Anubis crew about the signal being planted on the Scopuli to draw the Canterbury in so they can begin a conflict between Earth, Mars, and the Belt in order to keep everyone's eyes off of Eris. Now this dialogue is pretty freaking on the nose, but it can be forgiven as it's necessary to explain what's actually going on. In the novels, no bad guy blurts out a line like this, rather it's something that Miller and Holden piece together once they watch the recording about the proto-molecule. This of course never happens in the show, so they need some other way to put the pieces together. Also, we get a throwaway line with someone saying that it's hot in here, obviously alluding to the fact that the protomolecule is currently loose, unbeknownst to them. I actually think it works beautifully to tie everything together, and again, so great we get to see this from Julie's perspective, so I'll give this a +5. So then we see time pass for Julie as she's being held in the cell. We see her make the communication to let the OPA know where she is, which explains why Johnson sent Holden directly to the Anubis. Whereas in the novels, she contacts Johnson when she arrives on Eris, which is why in the novels Johnson sends Holden directly to Eris. So the show makes it clear that Julie was in her cell on the Anubis when it destroyed the Canterbury, and then shows the passage of time as she's trapped in the cell for a long time until it blends back into the very first scene of the entire show, which we get to see again, but this time with all of the context. And it's so much more powerful seeing in context, and the way it was shot and edited together, blending the audio of her screaming for help with the look of hopelessness on her face, was absolutely amazingly well done, so I'll give this another +5. Then we see Julie tether the Anubis to the asteroid. She sends a message to Dawes where we hear her voiceover as she explains what's going on and how she gets on the shuttle and heads over to Eris because that's the closest location. Now in the novels, this exposition is given to us by Miller reading her journal, so doing it as a voiceover is just as good. As for contacting Dawes, this is something that she doesn't do in the novels, but I'll get more into this later on. As for this scene, it works well in either medium, so I'll give it a 0. So then we cut to another scene we had already seen earlier in an earlier episode, this time with Miller searching Julie's room. This one doesn't seem as necessary, except that it re-emphasizes the bird, which will become important later on, so I'll talk about it then. It also re-emphasizes that the Anubis shuttle showed up at Eris, which blends right into the next scene. So the next scene is seeing Julie on Eris as she wanders the streets, and we get her voiceover of her saying she was trying to keep a low profile, but it was not easy. So we see her beat up someone to basically mug them and steal his credits in order to check herself into a hotel. Now in the novel, she is already aware that she's infected, which is with what she refers to as the Phoebe bug, but it's basically the protomolecule. The show is unclear of whether or not she's aware of it at this point, but in the novels, it was her primary motivation for checking herself into the hotel. And also, she doesn't have to mug someone for their money, or at least it's not mentioned either way. It's fine, so I'll give it a 0. So in the hotel room, they make it clear that her voiceover is another communique to Dawes. She even watches Dawes on the TV as she wonders why he never came to her aid. She then starts to realize that the power source in the room is making her infection worse, so she smashes all the power sources in the room. Now, in the novel, she was already aware from watching the same video about protogen that Miller and Holden would later watch. So she already knew that the protomolecule feeds on radiation, so she already knew to turn off all the power, so it wasn't this dramatic. Now let me talk about Dawes. In the novels, Julie Mal had no connection to Dawes whatsoever. Her handler was actually Fred Johnson, and Fred didn't abandon her the way Dawes seemed to in the novels. She simply communicated in such a way that a return communication would be impossible. So Johnson instead sent Holden after her, which was his way of sending her help. But this help unfortunately arrived too late, and she was dead by the time he got there. Whereas in the show, it makes it appear Dawes simply ignored her cries for help. This is no doubt done in order to paint him more like an asshole, as Dawes is much more of a villain in the show than he was in the books. As in the show, Holden discovers Julie by happenstance by investigating a transmission Fred received about the Anubis. And I gotta be honest, in this case, I actually like the book's version of events better, as it seems unnecessary to drag Dawes into this. Plus, I like the aspect of help coming too late better rather than her cries for help being completely ignored. So I actually give this a -2. So then we see her in her last moments of life as she succumbs to the protomolecule and we see her crawl naked on the floor to the shower where we know Miller and Holden will find her. She then talks about the Razorback, her racing ship, and how she doesn't want her father to take it away from her. And then she has a vision of Miller standing in the doorway holding her necklace that he takes everywhere he goes with him, and of the bird floating above his hand. First of all, the talk about the Razorback was meant to be mindless babble as her mind goes, but it does set up that her mind was on the Razorback moments before her death, which is actually very important for the events of episode 5 of season 2, where Julie is in control of the protomolecule, where she's flying Eris much in the same way she'd fly the Razorback. As for Miller, this is quite an important and powerful change some may not like because it changes the dynamic quite a bit, because never anywhere in the novels is it suggested that Julie has visions about Miller. This kind of changes the nature of the protomolecule to be a bit more prolific, or either, psychically bonds her to a man across the solar system who loves her, or it is able to give her a vision of the future, as we know that Julie and Miller will eventually come to connect through the protomolecule. I, for one, love it. I think it adds so much to their story. Yes, it does have a bit of mysticism, a bit more fantasy that was in the novels, but I think it does this in the best way possible, so I'll give it a +5. So then we finally catch up to the present. That is where the last episode left off, and that's with Miller, Holden, and the others finding Julie's dead body. Here we see Miller is really affected by her death. Naomi asks if he's okay, and Holden also seems concerned. When Miller tries to reach out for her, Holden gives him a firm warning of no. He touches his shoulder, but then immediately backs off when he sees how angry Miller is at the motion, but then speaks firmly but softly that she could be contagious. And I like how Miller, in his grief, is wise enough to heed his advice. And when they all decide the best idea is to leave as soon as possible, Miller refuses to budge, but Holden again speaks truth to Miller, telling him if he stays behind, he'll never be able to catch Julie's killer, so they all hightail it out of there. Now, in the novels, Miller wasn't so outwardly affected by Julie's death. He was, of course, inwardly affected, but he did a much better job of hiding it. That so much so that only Naomi picked up on how much he was affected by it. In fact, when Holden kept pressing him for more information, Naomi had to warn him to ease off because she could see how affected he was by her death, which Holden actually didn't realize at all and thought he seemed cool and collective. But this is a visual meeting, so it's actually a bit better in this case for us to see that Miller was hurt by this, so I'll give this a +1. So when Holden and the others go down to the lobby, they encounter Simatemba, who pulls a gun on them, and they pull their guns in response. They want to leave, but Simatemba won't let them. It almost seems like violence will erupt, but then Miller shows up and Simatemba asks what the hell he's gotten himself into and warns that even he can't clean up this mess. Miller then tells him Julie's dead, and for some reason he puts his gun down and lets them leave, but tells them not to leave the station until they can talk. Now, this exchange in the novels was much more amicable. As mentioned before, Simatemba showed up before they went up to Julie's room, and he wasn't alone. He had other cops with him, and he didn't seem as freaked out because Miller told him in advance what had happened, that he saw a bunch of goons shooting at these fine gentlemen, so came to their protection. So he seemed okay with it. However, similarly, he told them not to leave the station until he got a chance to talk to him, but it was apparent that Simatemba's friendship with Miller was more based on professional courtesy, and they weren't anywhere near as close as they are in the show. Overall, I think this was another false way to try to create tension by having Simatemba pull his gun on them. It really doesn't make any sense that he would act this way, that he wouldn't act the same way he did in the novel. So I'm actually going to give this a -2. So after Miller, Holden, and the others leave the hotel, they find a hidden corridor to talk in, where Miller asks Holden how he knew Julie was there, to which Holden answers a lot of his questions by saying, I don't know. Miller gets frustrated with Holden, slams him against the wall, and demands to know what he knows. Naomi comes to his defense and asks Amos why he isn't coming to his defense as well, and Amos replies that they all need to get off Eris as fast as possible. That's something they all agree, so they make plans to leave. Now, in the novels, Miller is not as hostile towards Holden the way he is in the show. In fact, instead of sneaking in a dark corridor, Miller pays for them to all stay in a hotel where they all have a nice long conversation and they hash everything out, which ends with Naomi hacking into Julie's personal pad and them reading her journal. Also, if this were the books, when Miller attacked Holden, Amos would have instantly put Miller flat on his ass. I really don't like this show dynamic where Amos and Holden don't get along. It really doesn't sit right with me. Plus, I think it's a huge mistake for the show to leave out this long conversation scene, as I think this was what was needed at this point so everyone knew what was going on. So I'm actually going to give this a -4. So we then cut over to Earth, where Avasarala visits the home of the friend she betrayed, who supposedly committed suicide. It seems Avasarala is also suspicious that this was a suicide, so looks for evidence at his home, but she has to confront his grieving husband, who isn't too happy to see her, but he begrudgingly gives her permission to enter his room, and there she finds a set of pencils. She takes them with her as she suspects they have data on them and hidden on them. And again, nothing remotely like this happens in the book, so I don't have much to say about this in terms of changes, other than the fact that I think the show did a great job of creating a storyline for Avasarala in season 1, and her Martian ambassador friend was a good way to do it, and I think this was a good way to get her emotionally invested in the main storyline and to switch her hard position of being a warhawk to realizing that she's being played. The way they used a death of her friend to portray this changing character totally sold me in her character journey in a way I think played out brilliantly, so I'm going to give this a +5. So then we cut over to Eris, where we see Anthony Dresden inspecting Julie Miles' room and finding she's been killed by the protomolecule. He takes a sample from her so that he has a sample of the protomolecule, and then tells his lackey to prepare to proceed as planned. So in the show, we meet Dresden in the scene previous where he takes over the crime scene from Sematimba. This does not happen in the novels. In fact, in the novels, Dresden isn't on Eris at all, or at least we don't see him there. I suppose it's possible he was there, but it just wasn't described in the book because none of our viewpoint characters saw him. But in the novels, we first see him later on when Miller and Holden explore the Anubis and find the recording from Protogen that explains what the protomolecule is. Dresden is the man who gives this presentation in the recording, although they don't actually meet him in person until the events of storming the research station, which doesn't happen in the show until season 2. However, Miller can tell from the recording that Dresden is a sociopath, which certainly seems to be the case here. However, in the novels, Dresden is described as a sleek, posh, attractive European rich man, whereas in the show he looks more like an average middle-class everyman American. Also, this is the show's way of foreshadowing what's about to go down on Eris, where in the novels this was done by Johnson intercepting a message from the Protogen spy and relaying it back to Holden, where the message read, "We retrieved the payload, proceed to stage 3. So this was basically the show's version of that, but it was a lot more direct as we see the villain prepare to do no good with the protomolecule. So I think this actually makes it a bit clearer, so I'll give it a +1. So then we get a scene with Jules Pierre Mal, which I believe is the first time we see him on the show outside of his messages to Julie. Anyway, he gets a message from Dresden where Dresden tells him that his daughter is dead and in fact shows him the body of his dead daughter. And he appears sympathetic of his loss, but asks if they should proceed with the experiment. And Mal is in tears, so obviously affected by his daughter's death, but he sends a reply to Dresden simply saying that they got lucky and to go ahead and proceed as planned. What he means by lucky is that they had lost the protomolecule when they lost track of the Anubis, but by finding Julie's dead body infected, they now have the protomolecule again. Also, this shows that he did love his daughter and was affected by her death, but that the experiment is still of vital importance to him, and he wouldn't let the loss of his daughter get in the way of that. In the novels, we get nothing like this. Jules Pierre isn't seen until book 2, and in book 1, he's never directly linked to the experiments on Eris, although he is the head of Protogen, so it seems likely that he would be involved. In fact, in book 2, he's under investigation, but his direct ties are never confirmed until book 2. Again, I really like this scene as it adds a lot to the story to confirm his involvement, and so his direct reaction to his daughter's death, and that he wouldn't let it get in the way of his ultimate plan, so I'll give this a +3. So then we go back to Eris, where Holden and Naomi talk to Miller to compare notes, where Miller confirms that Julie was sent by the OPA to investigate a bioweapon and got attacked by the stealth ship, while Amos and Alex are off trying to find a way to get off of Eris. Then an alert sounds and Alex informs them that a ship just blew up in the docks, causing a station-wide lockdown. The Rocinante is okay, but the station is locked down, so they can't get to it. Now, in the novels, this alert is a lot more vague and is more of just a general radiation alarm, which one might assume comes from an exploded ship. In fact, the crew speculate about this, but it's just speculation. It's implied that there is actually really no danger at all, and this was all just made up by Protogen to have an excuse to lock down the station, whereas here in the show, it's implied that they actually went as far as to destroy a ship so they can have an excuse to lock down the station. Honestly, either way works for me, so I'll give this a 0. So then we go back to Earth with Avasarala on a plane where she's testing the pencil she got from DeGraff's home and finds one does indeed have hidden data on it. It apparently is data of a ship's drives that were built on Earth, and Avasarala can't determine where these drives or where these ships are now. So this is of course her first big clue that these mysterious stealth ships were built by Earth, which of course also implies that DeGraff found out about this and was killed for it, which is a surefire way to piss Avasarala off. As I said before, nothing like this occurred in the books, but I think this adds a lot to Avasarala's motivation on why she wants to go after the fuckers involved in this conspiracy, so I'll give this a +4. So then we go back to Eris, where we see Holden and Miller accessing the situation from the hidden corridor. Miller realizes that the CPM guards are basically just a bunch of thugs to keep people in line, and the way that they are operating tells him the whole thing was planned, which makes Holden realize they probably destroyed the ship themselves. Miller then sees Dresden, who is obviously a big wig involved, so goes off to kill him, and Holden goes off to chase after Miller, but Naomi holds him back, saying that this isn't their problem, but Holden says that he's making it his problem and tells Naomi that if he isn't back in 3 hours, to leave without him. Now, in the novels, Miller actually wants to go with Holden, asks for a berth on his ship, rather than Holden following Miller around. It's actually the other way around. Miller's the one who wants to go with Holden. And as I mentioned, Dresden isn't even on Eris, so Miller doesn't see him and run after him. Rather, at this time, Miller realizes that the CPM guards are actually Ceres thugs, whom he had noticed earlier in the novels suddenly disappearing from Ceres, along with a lot of police riot gear, which he now recognizes that they're using on Eris. So they know the whole thing is planned, but they want to know where they're taking everyone. So Holden and Miller actually agree to go off and investigate what these thugs are doing, where Naomi takes the others to the ship. I actually like the prospect of Miller and Holden working together rather than Holden running after Miller to annoy him a lot better, so I'm going to give this a -2. So then we cut to the CPM thugs herding the population into shelters, where Dresden prepares to leave the station. Miller catches up to him, tries to shoot him, but Holden stops him and Dresden gets off the station. This pisses Miller off, so he punches Holden and they get into a brief fight that's broken up by the CPM thugs, but Miller gets the better of them, kills one of the thugs, and holds a gun to the other one's head. And apparently is all of a sudden all good with Holden, so he tosses him the other thug's gun. Now, in the novels, Holden and Miller purposely trap a guard. Holden distracts him while Miller sneaks up from behind. There's no assassination attempt or fight between Miller and Holden. And frankly, I think this is a very poor way to handle Miller and Holden's relationship, so I'm going to give this a -3. So then we cut back to Eris, where we see Fred Johnson preparing to make a big speech. He then makes this big speech, which he reads off of a teleprompter, so obviously a prepared speech. And this speech is transmitted everywhere as we see various people like Avasarala and Aaron Wright watching it. In the speech, Johnson reveals that the data he recovered from the Martian data clip from the Dollinger, and that chip data reveals that the stealth ships that destroyed the Canterbury and the Dollinger were built by Earth. Now, this is an important divergence from the novels, as in the novels, Johnson doesn't figure out that the ships were built by Earth. He can't make sense out of the data, so he sends it to Naomi, and she figures it out, and Holden is the one who instantly broadcasts this information to the entire solar system. This is actually an important ongoing character trait for Holden and a key point of contention between Holden and Miller in the novels that doesn't exist in the show. See, in the novels, Holden gets a reputation for starting wars by sharing all the information he learns willy-nilly. Now, in the books and the show, Holden finds evidence to suggest that the Martians destroyed the Canterbury, and so he broadcasts this message to everyone. However, the effects of this broadcast are kind of downplayed in the show, whereas in the novels he starts a huge war between Mars and the Belt, some describe as the most destructive war of all humankind. And then, when he broadcasts the information about the stealth ships being built by Earth, he starts an even bigger war between Earth and Mars. And so Miller constantly argues with him, sometimes threatening to shoot him about how stupid it is to just blab to the solar system at large every single piece of information he gets before he has time to think over the implication of revealing such information. In fact, it's not just Miller. He actually gains a reputation as being a man who started both major wars. This reputation, however, doesn't exist in the show, as the Belt didn't really go to war with Mars. It was more like a bunch of riots and then the Martians harassing some random Belter ships. And in the show, it wasn't even Holden that revealed the information about the stealth ships being built by Earth. It was Fred Johnson, which completely changes the dynamic. For the show, you can tell this is the moment Avasarala is completely convinced that there is a conspiracy in her own government that caused the whole thing, and one that she wants to take down. And Aaron Wright, you can tell, is being really smug, and he's preparing to have a smear campaign to try to discredit everything that Fred Johnson is saying, which I think is a very interesting dynamic. In the novels, this revelation would, of course, come much later. The Avasarala realizing that there's a conspiracy within the Earth. This doesn't happen until much later in Book 2, and it has more to do with the Book 2 storyline. However, overall, I have to say I was never a huge fan of the Holden being a blabberer who starts wars. That storyline in the novels never really interested me, and I actually much prefer the way it was handled here, as I think it adds a lot more dynamic by having Johnson be the one who reveals this information. So I'm going to give this a +4. So then we go back to Eris, where Miller interrogates the thug he captured, mostly asking about Dresden, and of course Dresden wasn't there in the books. The thug then tells him a lot of stuff that Miller reasoned out for himself in the novels, such as all the CPM guards being gangsters from series, and that this was planned months in advance. When they ask about why everyone is being herded into the shelters, the goon simply states he's just doing what he's told, which is basically the same thing he said in the novel. So here, Holden then reasons that if the thugs want these people to be in the shelters, then they need to get these people out of the shelters. Now, this is the way the novels, this is where the novels differ, as they more want to know why they are putting people in the shelters rather than it being a mission to save them. They want to know what Perdigen's purpose is on Eris. So when the thug refuses to help Miller, he shoots him and then says, oh, let's get this poor officer some help. So I think either way actually is fine, so I'll give this a 0. So then we go back to Naomi, Alex, and Amos trying to find a way off the station, where they all learn that all the ships have been locked down, so they try to come up with some alternative way to leave. Now in the novels, as I mentioned before, the only viewpoint characters are Miller and Holden, so when they split up from Naomi and the others, we don't touch base with them until they join up with them again when they leave Eris. Also, their plan of returning to the Rocinante in the novels is very simple. All they need to do is wait for the crowd of thugs herding the people into the shelters to pass, then get behind them, and then proceed to the Rocinante unmolested. Here in the show, it's more complicated. It has the thugs and the people seem to be everywhere. And I actually like the fact that they gave Naomi and the others something to do in this show, so I'll give this a +1. So next we see civilians trying to leave the station but being blocked by thugs that tell them to go to the shelters. Simatimba then appears and demands that they let the civilians through, but the thugs refuse to listen, and eventually they just shoot and kill the civilian that was complaining, so Simatimba shoots back and the firefight ensues. Naomi and Amos join in the firefight on Simatimba's side. Now in the novels we get nothing like this. In fact, we don't see Simatimba ever again in the novels after the firefight at the hotel. In fact, it's never really revealed what happened to him. I suppose it's assumed that he died there with everyone else on Eris. But it makes perfect sense that he wouldn't stand for what the thugs were doing, and this would lead to a firefight. So I actually really like this, so I'll give it a +2. So then we go to Holden and Miller taking the injured thug to the radiation shelter, and they pretend to be helping him to use him in order to get the other thugs protecting the door to go away. When the thug refuses to open the door, Miller punches him in his wound, and Holden swipes his card off of him and uses it to open the door. They charge in to see a bunch of people lying dead on the floor, or dying on the floor. And then a bunch of weird lights and warning sounds come on, and then Holden realizes that they have just been dosed with massive amounts of radiation. When Miller asks him how much, he responds by saying, "We're dead." Now, in the novels, they didn't shoot the guard. They simply threatened to shoot him and forced him to open the door. There were no other guards protecting it, but everything else went down pretty much the same way. Holden and Miller get dosed with a lethal amount of radiation. However, I do kind of object to the language used in the show, as Holden says, "We're dead," which I think is kind of misleading, since he knows that if they get back to the Rocinante in time, they can be cured, which they don't even mention here, which I think, I remember being really irritated by this when I first saw this episode, and the fact that they survived, because this line said that they couldn't survive, so that kind of bothered me, so I'll give it a -1. So my final adaptation score for Critical Mass is a +27, which I do believe is the highest score I've ever handed out yet, which makes total sense because I remember this being my favorite episode from season 1. So much in this episode, and all of it, there was so much that happened in this episode, and all of it was handled extremely well. The opening sequence, shown from Julie Mouse's perspective, was absolutely amazing and completely blew me away. The rest of the episode continued from there with a lot of great sequences, which is only slightly held back from a couple minor blunders here and there, but overall, a very powerful episode. So that's it for my book to show comparison for The Expanse Season 1 Episode 9. I will be back to cover the finale of Season 1 sometime next week, so make sure to keep an eye out for that, as well as many other videos that I do on The Expanse, as well as other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.